The biggest impression that Doom Eternal's left on me now that it's had some time to sink in is that id Software is back. Both Doom 2016 and now Eternal were basically home runs in my opinion, and id now sits pretty comfortably in a position of assumed quality. Whatever they end up doing next is a day one buy from me. They have my absolute faith. It's nice to feel that way about id Software again too, because despite being a fan of the legendary titles of old, there was a period of time where id Software didn't inspire that kind of trust for me, and that stemmed from their last game before the Doom reboot. Rage, released in 2011 and published by Bethesda Softworks, was an open-world first-person shooter and id's first new IP since Quake in 1996. Rage also marked the end of an era for id Software, as it's the last game made by the studio where founding member John Carmack worked on it, as well as the final game with the classic id Software movement first seen in Quake. It's hard to describe it if you haven't played any of these id in-house developed shooters from Quake to Rage, and the second-party games made by other teams like Return to Castle Wolfenstein or Quake 4. They all have a very specific and very distinct feel to how the player character moves around, aims, and jumps. Things like bunny hopping in Quake 1 and the more expanded strafe jumping in Quake 3 Arena were more advanced applications of the movement options in these games. Quake is the last game id was directly involved with which was featuring this kind of movement system, and while I do enjoy the new Doom games, it is sad to not have this style of player movement in any of id's titles after Rage. Now, before it sounds like I'm waxing nostalgic about this game, I have to stress up front. I didn't care for Rage when it came out. I played it once, I was very disappointed with it, and I never touched it again. Now that id Software is well on their comeback trail, I figured it was time to finally revisit the swan song of the studio's old era, and maybe see if I've been missing anything. Rage was id's stab at the open world genre, which around 2011 was picking up steam as the dominant AAA genre. All of the relevant tropes are here. Minigames around town, side quests, hubs, and points of interest separated by vast empty spaces, the whole shebang. Most of these features are pretty uninspired if I'm being blunt. The side quests and minigames are simple, with the only incentive for them being cash rewards. This might have been a valid enough reason, but at least in this playthrough, I found that I was usually drowning in cash just playing casually and selling any useless items that I collected. I only ever spent money on 2 items anyway, which we'll get to later, but overall, deviating from the main quest offers little reward. Speaking of the main quest, that doesn't fare too much better. At least in the early game. Main missions are short and shallow, offering little combat and ending a couple of minutes after you start them. As such, the rapid-fire pace of these early missions leads to a tedious loop of getting a mission, driving through a mostly empty wasteland to the spot, completing the mission shortly after arriving, driving back through the mostly empty wasteland, and then speaking with the quest giver to complete the task. Rinse and repeat. This is an issue that most open-world games have to varying degrees, but Rage makes it worse with the generally barren world you have to go through, and the short length of the missions themselves. The game's driving is what holds the open world together, and it's purely middle-of-the-road material. I never felt frustrated by the driving, but it does nothing to keep me engaged either. Not for lack of effort, mind you. There's car-based combat where you fight off raiders in their own Mad Max mobiles, but it's awkward to pull off, especially when one drives behind you and you have to turn around, reorient, and wait for the lock-on to trigger again. After a point, I just found it easier to drive past and ignore them entirely. The game also has racing, but again, this isn't anything special. The AI hardly puts up a fight, and even with my mediocre abilities in these types of games, I never once had any troubles with winning. The ease of the racing could be due to the difficulty that I was playing on. You see, I brought direct shame to my family bloodline, and I played Rage on normal instead of hard or nightmare. I do have a legit reason for this though, and that's due to Rage's bizarre idea of how to balance difficulty. On top of the basic features like enemies doing higher damage, Rage, for whatever reason, decided to have your gun's accuracy lower based on higher difficulties. Why on earth they decided to lower your ability to shoot on modes when your shots matter most, I could not tell you. But since I'm a petty bitch who hates forced inaccuracy like that, I opted out. Difficulty in general is an odd point in Rage. Even on normal, enemies got extremely tanky by the game's end, sometimes one taking a full magazine with the heavy machine gun's stronger ammo type to put down. That is, however, unless you figure out that the game's most busted weapon is in your hands before you even have the full roster. If you decide to play Rage, here's a pro tip for you. Go to the outfitter shop, talk to this dude, and get the schematic for pop rockets. From this point forward, only buy pop rockets, and make sure that you're stocked up with at least 100 of them before every mission. With the pop rockets, the shotgun becomes a DPS rocket launcher, killing the vast majority of enemies in 1 or 2 shots in even the final mission, and dropping almost all others with a mag dump. Pop rockets are dirt cheap and extremely effective, turning the enemies from sponges into messes that you have to clean up with one. It becomes a joke where you can just walk down most foes. For the sake of this playthrough, I was glad such a strategy existed, because playing Rage the way it was intended to be played at least most of the time, in other words, as a stop and pop cover shooter, really wasn't entertaining. Rage was the first and, to date, only id Software game to feature Call of Duty's style of regenerating health, and outside of the game's odd resurrection mechanic, you're about as frail under fire as you are in those games. What makes this more annoying is that, like some of the earlier Call of Duty games, Rage doesn't feature lean of any kind for its cover combat, so while enemies can poke their head out of cover and take pot shots, the player has to move their entire body into a line of fire. The lack of lean is a very questionable feature for a game with this style of combat, and Rage was definitely worse off for it. While features like the open world focus and regenerating health firmly place Rage as a game of its era, there are actually some decently forward-thinking ideas in it as well. Unlike other shooters of the time, Rage lets the player carry every weapon all at once, and all of those weapons have multiple ammo types. Just to name a few, for the shotgun you have the regular buckshot, and both of the aforementioned pop rockets and the EMP shell for turrets and generators. The pistol has 3 different ammo types, and an optional scope. Both machine guns have 2 ammo types, the crossbow has 3 different bolts, the works. And all of this is on top of the numerous gadgets you can use, like the killer boomerang, the explosive RC car, grenades, and more. Rage actually has a very expansive set of combat options for the player. But the issue with the balance is, while you could use all of these features, you'd be basically placing yourself at a distinct disadvantage. After all, the enemies are still fairly sturdy unless you use the pop rockets and turn them into gore confetti. Why use any of these expanded options when pop rockets are, without question or fail, the best solution 100% of the time? Even the BFG, which you only get for the game's last mission, is worse than the pop rockets. You're putting yourself at a distinct disadvantage for not using them. I guess there are some other things worth discussing, since the gameplay wasn't the only thing of significance in Rage. Briefly, we'll touch on the visuals, because Rage was the debut of the id Tech 5 engine. The big innovation of id Tech 5 was megatextures, which my dumbass will not try to detail here. Basically, the game didn't have multiple environmental textures, but one big texture that you can wrap around the environment. I guess, I don't know, I'm not an authority on this. The result of this engine? A complete mixed bag. From a distance, Rage's villas look gorgeous, especially for 2011 standards. On further inspection though, the game looks extremely muddy and poorly detailed once you start to get that close up. Not to mention, even on my current rig, which can run both Doom games on high, Rage had some pretty bad pop-in and low texture quality when turning around too quickly. This is a 9-year-old game. I fail to see why I'd have issues like this, but I chalk that up mostly to the engine, since other id Tech 5 games have similar issues as well. While that might be a letdown, Rage deserves special props in at least one area. The character animation here is nothing short of stellar. The way NPCs move and animate during conversations to how enemies all move around during combat look excellent. One detail I appreciate is how enemies react to damage based on where you shoot them, like how they'll limp a bit immediately after being shot in the leg. It's an attention to detail I appreciate, and one that really brings the world of Rage to life in a way that otherwise it wouldn't have been. While trying to wrap up on a more positive note, revisiting Rage wasn't a particularly joyous activity. While I can appreciate elements of it, Some clear work went into its presentation, and it's the final game to use that special style of movement id perfected in their shooters. These upsides don't make up for the numerous faults and uninspired features that Rage has. While I went into Rage hoping to have a similar experience to the one that I had revisiting Doom 3 last year, a retroactive enjoyment and appreciation, it really just wasn't the case. Rage is, in my opinion, the low point of id Software's story library and an average forgettable game on its own.